It talks about Mary's firstborn son. Now, explain further. Do they know how many other children she had, and were they at the crucifixion?
Now, you're a librarian, so I'm assuming you've read about this. Do you have an answer for us?
No, I do not.
That's an interesting. Why would you ask if they were at the crucifixion?
It talks about others being at the crucifixion, his mother and Mary Magdalene, and it talks about others there. Who were those others? Were they his family, or just his followers were gone? So who was there?
I've heard that James was Jesus' biological brother.
It talks about, it says something like that.
He says my brother. He uses that phrase and doesn't use it with other disciples. But I think, once again, I think we want to have the historical stuff nailed down like we do in our society today. And back then, people just didn't really care about what the specifics were. And most people were illiterate, couldn't write, and all that. But so I think what we're doing is operating with a lot of legend. But that's what I've heard. And do you two have any?
It does say that, like, Mary had other children, right? In one of the Gospels that we've read recently.
Yeah.
Because it says they didn't have marital relations until later.
Well,
then they come and visit him. Like it says, all his brothers and sisters. But that's when Jesus says, like, anyone who follows me is my brother. And to me, that's what's more important, is not who else was in his family tree, but, that we all, by believing, become a family of believers.
This is a big deal for traditional Catholics, too, because for them, Mary did not have any other children. And it's kind of establishing that purity piece and really keeping it very, very special that Jesus was her son. So it kind of depends on who you're talking to also.
But they'll say that he has cousins.
Yeah.
Lots
depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah. Some of the Catholics will say that those people that came that are called brothers and sisters are really just his cousins.
Family members. But I really like your question about who was there at the crucifixion, because that is so central for the gospel writers. And the answer will change depending on which gospel you read, depending on what the author is trying to emphasize. So like you read John, and at the end there are no disciples there except for the beloved disciple. So really, more so than who was there, who were the others, it's the people they name that are really important, because those are, in John, it's just showing that he is totally abandoned except by these few. And so just that desolateness is emphasized.
Also, if I could make a quick plug for an adult ed that's coming up this spring. You're hearing all these things like, wait, Mark says something different than Luke, says something different than John, and why aren't they all the same? Come to my adult ed this spring. It'll be 4 weeks on the 4 different Gospels, and why we have 4, and what makes them different, and if the differences, like why the differences matter, if they do. Like we have these 2 different birth narratives of Jesus, but that doesn't mean that, like, 2 totally separate things happened, or that, so we're going to be talking about some of those questions. If these questions are coming up in your brain, like, why do they all say such different things? Come and talk about it this spring.
That'll be fun.
It'll be fun.
Other questions? Good one over, Mason.
Raise your hand, Mason.
Oh, college boy.
Fortunately, it's not seminary.
So back on the Magi, we were told they come from the east and they follow the star, but not much was told about how they figured it out. I mean, people in Herod's court were said to have, there's a new king being born in Bethlehem, too. But out of the entire world, I didn't know what they used as references, because the Jewish traditions kept them pretty, close to home, from what I understand from historical references. So I was wondering what they used, or where they're from.
No idea.
That's sad.
There's no historical reference to say where they came from. Like, once again, legends build up about where they came from. But the two phenomenal things I think strike that story for me is, number one, they come as if they are insiders, and they are celebrating this birth of the King of the Jews. And it makes the question, you ask the question, why? What would they care about the birth of a king to this little tiny nation that's kind of stuck in the crossroads of the entire world? And yet, here they are. They are so excited. They have come all this distance with these incredible gifts and are ready to celebrate. So that doesn't get answered, except that what a great story for how God works in the world. You know, the minute we think that we've got God locked in a box, God invites these people from some far part of the world, and they have every bit as much right to celebrate this gift. They get it, which is kind of a consistent theme through particularly Mark, but all the Gospels is those who are on the inside should get it and don't. Those who are on the outside and shouldn't get it do. So it's a wonderful reminder that God's got a much bigger imagination, and the Spirit is working in much bigger ways than we ever give them credit for. Any other references you guys can think of?
Just that Matthew, I think, is really trying to highlight the kingly aspects of Jesus. He was writing very specifically to a Jewish audience, so he's the one that's always saying, this was done to fulfill the prophet, this was done to fulfill the prophet, blah, blah, blah. And so I think that was a big sign for him, like, look, when this kid was born, it wasn't just like some kids from the field that were excited. It was like the royalty of the continent converged to celebrate this new king of ours. So I think that sort of was more of Matthew's point. But that doesn't answer your question about where they came from or how they got there.
Okay. Well, then, can I ask a question in relation to this? It's an easy question to get. Is there any indication in the Old Testament that brings up the point of having other royalty come to honor this newborn king? Yes.
You look at the Psalms over and over and over again. It's the nations shall come together, the nations shall bow down, the nations shall proclaim. All of that, yeah, totally.
The other question, maybe it was just scientific curiosity that brought them, because they were following the star, trying to figure out what caused that to take place. Because back then there was no scientific explanation for things. It was something that.
But the kings probably wouldn't have been their own astronomers.
Well, nothing says that the Magi
Right.
were
Yeah.
kings either.
Yeah.
So.
They were maybe scientists or maybe magicians.
Well, and that all brings up another interesting question about the whole thing of astrology. I was over in Israel, and there was a synagogue, first century synagogue that they'd uncovered in Capernaum. And there was a zodiac symbol, mosaic, in the floor of a synagogue, which is just a little bit weird, So it kind of makes you wonder about that. But something brought them, and they certainly came with the intent of finding the king, it says Matthew.
Played him well in the story.
Yes, it did. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Everybody at once. You haven't stumped him yet. Come on, give him something hard. Maybe we should ask the chaplain to give us.
We've got one over there, it looks like.
I just got one quick one.
Wait for the mic.
Wait for the mic out.
So that we can.
We want to make sure everybody gets to hear.
I think I can talk about that. Is it possible that Christianity started spreading into the Near and Far East a number of years before the birth of Christ?
Say some more about that.
And you look at some of the Old Testament, and they're talking about the coming of nations together, bowing down. Now, the Old Testament, if you're looking back in that, people I know are going to go out, and it doesn't matter what religion, you're going to be spreading your religion. So, at that time, there were major trade routes that went all the way from the European area all the way through to China, the great tea routes, which now they know that they're there, but they can find parts of the route, but not all of them. And there was major trade between the different nations. It's just my personal opinion that yes, if I wanted to spread my religion, yes, I'm going to go into those areas where I don't know, and I'm going to talk about my religion and things that the great prophets have said, which was the Old Testament.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's no accident that when Paul went out to do his missions, he sought out Jewish congregations. And the reason was because they didn't see any distinction between Jew and Christian at that time. For Paul, it made perfect sense that Jesus was the Messiah. This is what Jews have been waiting for years. So I think anybody who had that sense of messianic destiny, who was certain that God would bring someone to fulfill that role and save the nations, I think they made it quite. I think the Spirit made the world quite ready to receive the gospel of Jesus. I don't think anybody knew, and it took years to finally figure it out. I think for most of the people, exactly what Jesus was and how he fit in this strange thing. Because frankly, their idea of a Messiah was a king and someone who would be powerful and he would unite the nation simply by speaking and making it happen. Political takeover, and Jesus turns it on his head, and even his poor disciples. I mean, would you have wanted to been one of his disciples? I remember seeing a cartoon that showed Jesus sitting on a rock with his head in his hands like this. And forgive my French, but one of the disciples says, "Do you ever have days when you just want to say to hell with it all?" And I'm thinking, that's Jesus must have been just. I mean, sometimes he says, "Don't you get it? How many times do I have to tell you?"
Well, and sort of on that, you can see, like, in the crucifixion when they're yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him," because they're like, this isn't what we were looking for. And Barabbas was actually a political rebel in a lot of ways, which is the shortest way to tell that story. But so when they choose Barabbas, like, this is somebody who's fighting against the establishment. This is what we're expecting. And so when Jesus comes turning the other cheek, they're like, that's not a king. That's not what we're looking for. So it did take a long time for these Jewish communities to figure out that Jesus mattered and then what difference that made. But
Rachel, anything?
Amen.